Hey guys, it's Lola here and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if it's your very first time watching a video of mine. First and foremost, I hope you're all keeping well. It's a really crazy time. I don't think any of us thought 2020 would be like this. And yeah, I'm just reconciling it in my own mind. I've been isolating with everybody else in the UK where the situation hasn't been amazing, and we've had quite a lot of cases, so I've just been trying to be careful. Now things are starting to open up. I thought actually I should get back on YouTube since we're moving more towards normality, but I also wanted to be respectful of the time that we're in and make a video which may be helpful for people who are experiencing difficulties at work, namely redundancy. It's something that we're seeing increasing, and we're going to see continue increasing because there is just a lot of economic uncertainty and lots of companies haven't been able to weather the storm that is Corona. And so yeah, this is probably not going to make it any easier for anybody going through a redundancy process, but at least will help you to understand what redundancy is, what to expect, what your rights are, and maybe some advice on what to do if you're faced with redundancy. So if that would be helpful to you, please do stick around. So firstly, what is redundancy? Well, redundancy is a type of dismissal where an employer needs to reduce its workforce, and there are various reasons why it may need to reduce its workforce, but typically we see it as a result of a reduction in work. So if you think about what's been happening over the last few months of lockdown, where businesses have had to close, there's been no work to do, and they're not taking as much money, and they actually may not have enough money to pay employees, and that may lead to redundancy. Even where they do have enough money to pay employees, they may say, actually, we just don't need them anymore. There's not enough work to be done. Let's say a company was producing 1,000 widgets and it took them 10 people to do that. Now there's only demand for 500 widgets. So actually, they don't need 10 people anymore. They may only need 5. And so they may have to make 5 people redundant in that situation. You may also hear redundancy discussed in the context of a restructure. And that just means that currently the business is structured in one way, and it's going to be structured, or they're thinking about structuring it in a different way. And as a result, some of those roles may no longer be required. So let's say there is a head of department. That head of department currently manages 2 supervisors, and they both manage 2 assistants each. We may say, hey, we're restructuring, we want to move to a flatter structure. So we're going to have the assistants reporting into the head of department, and the supervisory layer is going to be removed. And that will be our new department or organization structure. And as a result of that, these 2 supervisors, this supervisory layer, we're going to make those people redundant. So that's how it may come up when people are talking about a restructure or a reorganization. And in the most extreme cases, some businesses just fail. So where a business, goes into administration or something like that, obviously if the business is not trading, it no longer needs employees. So typically where a business goes into administration, they would make their employees, all of them, usually redundant. So what does that mean for you as an employee who is facing redundancy? The answer to that will depend on a few different things, and one of them is your length of service, and 2 is like the magic number in a lot of UK employment law. And that's because after 2 years you become entitled to a number of employment rights that you wouldn't have otherwise. So that's 2 years continuous service with the same employer. And some of those are related to redundancy, and unfortunately if you don't have 2 years service, your employer doesn't really have to do much if they want to make you redundant. So they can just notify you. They can say, hey, unfortunately, we need to make some redundancies for this reason, and you've been selected. And that's fine. They are allowed to do that. What they're not allowed to do, of course, is select you in some unfair way. And it would be unfair if they discriminated against you. So there are like 9 protected characteristics. And if they selected you based on any of those, like age, race, gender reassignment, marriage, blah, blah, there's 9 of them. And I'll list them here so you can see. But if you've been selected on one of those bases, so let's say you're pregnant, and they want to make some people redundant, they say, well, she's pregnant, so we don't want her. Any employer that did that would be insane and ridiculous. But if they did do that, then obviously you could challenge it on that basis. Otherwise, there is very little that you can do. They still need to do things like pay your notice pay and your holiday pay and all those other things, but nothing really related to the redundancy do they need to do. The exception to this would be if your employer was required to go through some sort of collective consultation process, which we'll speak about shortly when we speak about kind of the rights of employees with more than 2 years service. But unfortunately, if you have less than 2 years service, there's very little that you can do in a redundancy situation. If you have more than 2 years service, you have a lot more rights when it comes to redundancy, and your employer has a lot more obligations when it comes to redundancy. And the first one is the right to be consulted, and that means that your employer must discuss your redundancy with you, or the prospect of making you redundant, with the aim of explaining to you the reason for the redundancy and exploring other alternatives to redundancy. So your employer may say, hey, we think we're going to have to make people redundant, and they'll tell you that you're at risk of redundancy. But until you've been consulted, if you have more than 2 years service, they cannot make you redundant. They need to first discuss it with you and give you an opportunity to suggest alternatives to redundancy. So there's been examples of, employers saying, hey, we're going to have to make 20% of the workforce redundant. And actually the workforce have come together and said, hey, we don't want to make 20% of the workforce redundant. We would all rather go down to 80% pay, or we'll all go down to 4 days a week, because then we save 20% and no one has to be made redundant. Or it could be your employer may say, hey, I have to make you redundant, and you say, hey, why don't you move me to part-time and move the other person to part-time and see if we can do some sort of job share. So consultation is it's for you and also for your employer. A lot of the time you might have a leadership team making decisions, and they don't necessarily have all the answers, and consultation recognizes that. It says, hey, this is what they've thought, but there may be better alternatives that come out from the employees that mean we don't have to make people redundant, or we make less people redundant. Consultation can be either individual or collective, right? So if your employer is going to make more than 20 employees redundant from a single entity, from like a single company, so if you're a group, for instance, of 3 companies, if your employer was going to make more than 20 people redundant at one location, so 20 people in the Stafford office from this particular group company were going to be made redundant, then they have to engage in something called collective consultation. So that's where, rather than speak to you on a one-to-one basis, they need to speak to everybody together, and it has to take at least 30 days. They need to give at least 30 days for consultation. So it has to be a month of discussion. It can be back and forth. Usually an employee representative would be elected, or you'd have a trade union representative if your kind of workforce is unionized. But if it is less than 20 employees from a single group company in a single location, then your employer does not have the responsibility or the obligation to consult collectively. So that means that they could have an individual one-to-one consultation with you, and there's no kind of time frame in which to do that. So they may consult with you one day and say that's enough time to kind of consider, and then the next day you could be made redundant. Or they could consult with you and it may take 3 weeks, and they may come back to you with a proposal or something like that. But often people get very confused about collective consultation. It has to be more than 20 employees at one location. And even if you have less than 2 years service, you would still be included within the collective consultation if your employer needs to do it. So even if you have less than 2 years service, you will be invited to collectively consult as well if your employer has to collectively consult. And so that's the first kind of obligation and right you have. So if you have more than 2 years service and your employer is saying that they're going to make you redundant, or is considering it, or it's one of the options, then you will be invited to a consultation meeting. And if you're not, then obviously you should ask for one, because it is your right. So with the redundancy consultation process, the whole point of it is to come up with options to avoid redundancies, right? So your employer is saying, hey, let's discuss it together. Let's see if there is a way to avoid this, or if ultimately we have to end up there. So the timeline would usually be, you'd be notified that you're at risk of redundancy, which means that, and there are a number of things that could happen, and one of them is redundancy. And then you would be consulted with, and then they'd see if there were any kind of solutions to come out of that. And at the end of the consultation process, you'd be issued with an outcome, and the outcome would say, hey, sorry, you're going to be made redundant. Or it would say, hey, we found a suitable alternative role for you, or we found another thing, or we're not going to change your role in the end. One of the outcomes there, as I said, is a suitable alternative role. And that's one of the responsibilities your employer has in terms of your redundancy if you have more than 2 years service. So if there is another role within the organisation, and sometimes this happens, with a reorganization, some roles get removed, but some roles get added. A new role may be added, which is maybe not exactly your job, not the same job, but there's enough overlap in that role for it to be a suitable alternative for you, or you have the right skills and capabilities so that that role is a suitable alternative. There is nothing that kind of says concretely whether a role is a suitable alternative. It's a bit of a judgment. So you may think it's a suitable alternative for you, but your employer may not. So you might say, hey, give me that role because I think I can do that and it's a suitable alternative. But your employer may say, hey, I don't actually think that's a suitable alternative. Or, vice versa, your employer may present you with a role and say, hey, I think this is a suitable alternative for you. And you say, I don't think that is. I don't think I can do that. I don't want to do that. It's not the same or similar to the role I was doing before. So it is a bit of a judgment call, which can make it a little bit complicated. Typically, the things that might make it a suitable alternative would be, the roles and responsibilities. Are they similar to kind of what you've been doing, or have some overlap? The status of the role, is it at the same level as that you've been working at? The terms, what are the pay and the benefits associated with it? It could be more money or less money and still be a suitable alternative. We're looking at all of these things in kind of the round. And then you look at your kind of personal circumstances. So if there's a role which is like, 100 miles down the road, but it's the same, that's probably not going to be a suitable alternative for you because it will be very difficult for you to get there every day. So, when there is another role, you should look at the role and say, hey, do I think this is a suitable alternative for me? And your employer can do the same. Hopefully those two things are aligned. And if there is a suitable alternative for you, your employer is required to present it to you, right? So they say, hey, your role is going to disappear, but there's a new role here and we want to give this to you. You won't necessarily have to interview for the role or anything like that. That's just them saying, your role is gone, here is a new role, do you want it? And it's very important that you think about that. If you are presented with a suitable alternative role and you don't agree it is a suitable alternative, if you turn it down, you may jeopardize your redundancy pay. So we're going to speak about redundancy pay shortly, but that is one of the rights that you would have. If you have more than 2 years service, you're entitled to at least statutory redundancy pay. And if your employer tries to avoid your redundancy by giving you another role and you say no, they may be entitled to say you're not getting any pay then and you just leave. And obviously that's a situation you want to avoid kind of financially. It would put you in not the best situation. And if there is a suitable alternative and you're not sure about it, the best thing to do would be to ask for a trial period. Your employer is able to give you a 4-week period for you to try that role. And the point of that 4-week period is to say, hey, okay, this is different to what I've been doing, but let's see how I get on with it. At the end of that 4-week period, you can then speak to your employer and say, hey, this is working or it's not working, or your employer may say the same. And at that point, if it's not working, you can walk away and still be entitled to your redundancy pay. But if you don't at least try with the job that they're presenting you to avoid the redundancy, then your employer, it may be at liberty to say, well, we're not going to pay you your redundancy pay. So that's something to bear in mind. Another right that you should be aware of is your right to reasonable time off to look for work. And so the redundancy timeline starts here with your employer telling you that you're at risk of redundancy. You then enter a consultation process, which could be anything from 1 day to however many days, but will be at least 30 days if you're involved in a collective consultation. At the end of the consultation period, you will be notified of the outcome, and one of those outcomes may be, that your role is definitely going to be made redundant, and at that point, your notice period will start. So if you had a 4-week notice period, it would start ticking from the date that you're notified that you're definitely getting made redundant, right? And from the date that, you're told that you're at risk of redundancy, you then have the right to reasonable time off to look for work. So what that means is, the law recognizes that as soon as your employer tells you you may be losing your job, you want to start looking for other jobs. You want to start applying, going to interviews, all of this other stuff. So if you do have an interview that you would like to attend, your employer has to give you paid time off for that. The law says reasonable, and no one really knows what reasonable is, but it's generally accepted that up to kind of 2/5, so up to 40% of your working week can be paid in order for you to go to interviews and things like that. So if an interview comes up, any reasonable employer, to be honest, would allow you to go anyway, but statutorily your employer should be flexible with you and they should pay you to attend that. So if you take half a day off on a Friday afternoon to attend an interview to make sure that once you're made redundant, if you're made redundant, you have a job to go to, your employer will pay you for that. If you want to take more than 2 days off in a week to kind of attend interviews, your employer may not necessarily have to pay you for that. They may choose to, but legally they won't have to. Redundancy pay is one of the employment rights that you're only entitled to if you have more than 2 years continuous service with your employer. That means if you have less than 2 years service, your employer is not required to pay you any redundancy pay or any compensation for making you redundant. Statutory redundancy pay is very formulaic. So you get a certain amount of money for every year's service and depending on your age. So what that means practically is you'll get half a week's pay for every year of service you had when you were younger than 22. You'll get 1 week's pay for every year of service you had when you were between the ages of 22 and 41. And then you'll get 1.5 weeks pay for every year of service you had when you were older than 41, right? So let's say you're 46 and you have 10 years service. 5 weeks would be paid at 1 week's pay because you were younger than 41, and 5 weeks would be paid at 1.5 weeks pay because you were older than 41. However, every week's pay is capped. So it's capped at £538, at least for this tax year, per year. So that essentially means if you earn more than like £27,000, you don't actually get a full week's pay. It's capped at £538 a week. So if you earn less than 27 grand, you will get the kind of full week's pay. More than, it will be capped. So if a week's pay for you is £600 and you've had 5 years service and you're 30 years old, you wouldn't get £3,000 because the amount is capped at £538. So you would get an amount more equivalent to £2,700, right? The 538 times 5, whatever that equals. And it's the same. So if you had 10 years service, then and you were 35, rather than getting, £6,000, you'd get 5,380 or whatever it figures out to be. So it can be a little bit misleading because you think you get 1 week's pay, but actually, if you earn above that threshold of 27,000 or whatever, you don't actually get 1 week's pay. It's 1 week's pay with the cap of £538 applied. Of course, an employer may opt to pay enhanced redundancy pay. So that means that they'll pay over and above the statutory minimum that they have to pay because they want to, support you a little bit more in finding a new job, having that time off or whatever you need to look. They don't have to do that. They can choose to. They can also choose to pay redundancy pay to people who have less than 2 years service that they're making redundant. That's a choice. And often you'll see it, like a company will have a redundancy policy, will say this is how we'll treat all our employees. Of course, in kind of the economic environment as it is, lots of companies will still choose to pay statutory redundancy pay because they may not necessarily have the money to fund enhanced redundancy pay. So if you have less than 2 years service, your employer may choose to give you something, but they don't have to. And if you have more than 2 years service, they could choose to pay you, your weekly multiple up to the £538, or they could choose to do it kind of over and above, but they don't have to. So to summarize, if you have less than 2 years service, there's very little that your employer needs to do in order to make you redundant. Usually it will just be a notification. If you have more than 2 years service, you have the right to be consulted. So your employer must listen to your suggestions and explain to you the reasons for the redundancy. You have the right to reasonable time off. So if you're told you're at risk of redundancy, you are allowed time off for interviews, reasonable, and that's usually up to 40%. So if you work full time, up to 2 days full pay. You have the right to be told about suitable alternatives and offered suitable alternatives to redundancy. So if there is another role in the business you could do, your employer can offer that to you as a suitable alternative to your redundancy. They should offer that to you. And finally, you have the right to redundancy pay, which would be based on your age, how much you earn, and your length of service in the business. That's about it. Those are the things that I wanted to share around redundancy and your rights. These processes are never easy to go through. As you can imagine, lots of stress and anxiety related to kind of job security, financial stability, other commitments. I would encourage you to really engage in the process if you have the opportunity to go through a consultation process. Ask questions, make suggestions. Your idea could be the one that they haven't yet considered that could make a difference to your job or someone else's job. Also, take advice, like there are lots of free services, so you shouldn't have to necessarily pay for advice. You shouldn't pay for advice. I wouldn't encourage you to, actually. There are services like ACAS, Citizens Advice, .gov.uk, your employee assistance program. So if you're not sure about something or your rights, or you're not sure if your employer is handling things in the right way, ask one of these services. They have loads of information on their websites, which I'll link below, and also most of them you can call up and just ask questions to. And finally, ask your employer if they're able to offer any sort of outplacement service. So it could be that they are offering some money for you to do some training courses or stuff like that, or they might be running like interview skills workshops for those who haven't interviewed in a while. Or even if they're not offering anything formally, ask your line manager to write you a recommendation on LinkedIn, or if they can look at your CV and those sort of things. It's very easy just to disengage with the process and say, hey, I have to leave, I'm going to leave. But there will be relationships and people in the business which may be helpful to you later. So I would definitely encourage you to engage as much as you can, even through such a difficult time. I think that's about everything I wanted to say. So all that's left for me to say is thank you for watching this video. If you are going through this process, I'm very sorry to hear that. And hopefully you found this video helpful. If you know someone who's going through a process that might find this video helpful, please do share it with them. Like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. And if you have a question which I haven't answered in the video, please drop me a comment and I will try to get back to you with a response, or just tell you that I don't know if I don't know. Okay, so thank you very much and I'll see you next time. Bye.